In the early 1970s, strange women began appearing in the maternity wards and poor neighborhoods of developing nations. They wore immaculate starched white uniforms, smiled professionally, and spoke with the absolute authority of certified medical nurses. They approached young mothers who had just given birth, gently handing them shiny metal tins of baby formula, free samples from the European corporate giant, Nestlé. They claimed this was a miracle of Western science, a superior alternative that would make their babies stronger and healthier than simple breast milk. But these women in white coats had no medical training whatsoever. They were sales representatives on a commission, and they had been deployed to execute the most cynical corporate marketing strategy of the 20th century. The scheme relied on a terrifying piece of biological engineering. The free samples in the tin lasted for exactly 1 week. For those 7 days, the young mother fed her baby from a bottle, and without natural stimulation, her own breast milk dried up completely. By the time the free powder ran out, the trap snapped shut. The mother no longer had a biological choice. Her natural ability to nurse was gone, and she was now forced to buy the expensive formula every single day, giving away her family's entire livelihood. But the corporation deliberately hid the most lethal variable. They knew they were aggressively pushing a product into regions with no running water, no electricity, and no sterilization equipment. In impoverished villages, desperate mothers mixed the powder with contaminated water from local ditches. Worse, because of extreme poverty, they diluted the formula to 3 or 4 times its normal thinness to make a single tin last for a month. The pristine Western product became a deadly biological poison inside a dirty plastic bottle. Babies began dying by the thousands, starved to the bone, right in the arms of their deceived parents. As the scale of the tragedy reached catastrophic proportions, one man decided to go to war against the multi-billion-dollar empire. A young British investigative journalist uncovered the secret hospital reports and published a devastating exposé, calling the crime exactly what it was. In response, Nestlé made a fatal mistake. Instead of stopping their campaign, they decided to use their endless legal wealth to crush the journalist and his allies in a Swiss courtroom. This trial was meant to be a public execution for anyone who dared to stand against the corporation. But how did a transnational giant, spending millions on the most ruthless lawyers, end up backing itself into a legal trap? What was the true, horrific price paid by millions of families for a beautiful corporate slogan? And why did the final verdict of a Swiss judge send shockwaves through the entire Nestlé boardroom? The answers lay hidden in the files they were so desperately trying to destroy. To understand the genealogy of this corporate dynamic, one must look back to the middle of the 19th century. In 1867, a German-born pharmacist named Henri Nestlé created a product in Switzerland called farine lactée, a combination of alpine milk, wheat flour, and sugar. His motives were entirely noble. In those days, infant mortality was a horrific reality, and the formula was engineered as a life-saving alternative for premature babies or orphans who had no access to a mother's milk. Henri Nestlé famously saved the life of a neighbor's child who could not digest any other food. As the symbol of his invention, Henri chose a warm, beautiful bird's nest with tiny fledglings being fed by their mother. It was the visual embodiment of absolute safety, love, and protection. For decades, the company grew on the strength of this compassionate image. But by the middle of the 20th century, the small Swiss laboratory had transformed into a massive transnational conglomerate. The company was now run by efficiency-driven executives in high-priced suits, for whom the bird's nest was simply a highly profitable trademark, and whose sole metric of success was the infinite growth of profit margins. By the 1960s, the market for infant formula in the United States and Europe had become completely saturated. The Western birth rate was declining, and the directors faced a brutal corporate dilemma. Where could they find new consumers to maintain their growth? The answer lay on the map: the massive developing regions of Africa, Asia, and South America. There were millions of potential customers there. There was only one problem: These millions of women had no issues with their breast milk. Nature provided it to them flawlessly and for free. The corporation realized that to create a market, they had to declare war on nature itself, creating a psychological demand where none existed. They launched a campaign to convince an entire hemisphere that traditional motherhood was primitive, and that true. Modern love came out of a factory canister, but the executives in Switzerland completely ignored the physical reality of the world they were invading. And that ignorance would soon turn into a corporate body count. The corporate marketing machine descended upon the developing world not with standard advertisements, but with a psychological operation. The strategy was simple: weaponize the immense trust that uneducated people had in modern Western medicine. Nestlé hired an army of local women, bypassed standard employment laws, and dressed them up in crisp, authoritative nurse uniforms. These sales girls were sent directly into government hospitals, maternity wards, and rural villages. They walked into the rooms of mothers who had given birth just hours prior. They checked the babies, offered advice with professional confidence, and handed out the free starter kits of formula. To the poor, illiterate mothers, these women were official medical authorities. In reality, they were highly incentivized salespeople whose monthly bonuses depended entirely on how many mothers they hooked onto the powder. The biological trap worked with terrifying efficiency. When a newborn feeds from a bottle for a week, the mother's body stops receiving the neurological signals required to produce milk. Lactation physically shuts down. When the mother left the hospital and the free sample was empty, she discovered the horrifying reality. Her body could no longer feed her child. She was trapped in an artificial ecosystem. She was now a permanent customer of a Swiss corporation, required to buy a product she could not afford, just to keep her baby alive. In countries like Jamaica, Nigeria, and the Philippines, a single month's supply of Nestlé formula could easily cost up to 40 or 50% of a laborer's total family income. Desperate to make the expensive powder stretch, mothers began committing a fatal mistake. They would use only a fraction of the required scoop, diluting the mixture with water until it was nothing more than a cloudy, translucent liquid, completely devoid of nutrients. The babies were being systematically starved. But starvation was only half of the nightmare. The instructions on the back of the tin required the formula to be mixed with boiled, sterilized water and fed through thoroughly boiled glass bottles. In the shanty towns and rural villages of the global south, clean running water did not exist. Fuel for fire was expensive and scarce. Mothers mixed the chemical powder with contaminated water drawn directly from stagnant ponds and open ditches. The bottles were never washed properly because there was no clean water to wash them with. The plastic nipples became breeding grounds for lethal bacteria. Nestlé was fully aware of these socioeconomic conditions. Their own field reports detailed the lack of clean water and the extreme poverty of their target audience. Yet, the corporate strategy never changed. The billboards kept going up across Africa, showing glowing, chubby Western babies next to a Nestlé tin. The company chose to prioritize the sales curve over human biology, and by the early 1970s, pediatricians in developing countries began noticing a horrific spike in a disease they called commerciogenic malnutrition. Hospital wards were overflowing with infants reduced to living skeletons, dying of severe diarrhea and dehydration. The crisis was a silent, global epidemic, until a young journalist decided to track the money. In 1973, a 26-year-old British investigative journalist named Mike Müller arrived in Africa. He began visiting local hospitals, talking to doctors who were furious and heartbroken. They showed him rows of metal cribs filled with dying infants, and right next to those cribs stood the empty, colorful tins of Nestlé formula. The doctors told him plainly, "This is not a natural famine. This is corporate homicide." Müller began a covert investigation into the marketing practices of Nestlé and other Western companies. He tracked down the fake nurses, interviewed former sales agents, and collected internal corporate memos. He documented how Nestlé paid kickbacks to hospital administrators, gave free refrigerators to doctors who recommended their brand, and even sponsored medical conferences to keep the medical establishment quiet. The level of institutional corruption was absolute. Müller returned to London and compiled his findings into a brutal, uncompromising report for a British charity called War on Want. In March of 1974, the report was published under a title that struck like a lightning bolt: The Baby Killer. It was a concise, fact-driven indictment of corporate greed. It exposed how Nestlé's marketing directly resulted in the deaths of thousands of infants by converting mothers away from safe, free breast milk to an unaffordable, hazardous product. The report caused an immediate sensation in Europe, but its distribution was initially limited to the English-speaking world. That changed when a small, radical political activist group in Switzerland called the Third World Action Group got hold of it. They realized that the monster was headquartered right on their own soil in the quiet, wealthy town of Vevey. They translated Müller's report into German so the Swiss public could read it, but they made a deliberate, aggressive editorial choice. They threw away the academic title and replaced it with a phrase that was a direct declaration of a war. The German edition was titled, Nestlé Kills Babies. The response from the corporate headquarters was instantaneous and furious. Nestlé's board of directors, accustomed to total control and absolute prestige, realized that this title was a mortal threat to their global empire. If the public believed that the company's flagship product was actively murdering children, the brand would be ruined forever. The executives huddled with their legal team and made a decision that would define the rest of the decade. They refused to alter their marketing, and instead, they filed a massive criminal defamation lawsuit against the Swiss activists. They were determined to use the full weight of the Swiss legal system to completely destroy their critics. The criminal defamation trial opened in a courtroom in Bern, Switzerland, in 1975. Nestlé spared no expense. They brought in an elite team of corporate attorneys, backed by crates of heavily managed statistics and public relations documents. Their legal argument was rigid. The claim that Nestlé was killing babies was a malicious, factual lie designed to damage a proud Swiss institution. They argued that if a mother used contaminated water or diluted the formula, it was an issue of local education and personal responsibility, not a fault of the corporation. But the young activists and their defense lawyers refused to back down. They turned the courtroom from a defense arena into a tribunal against Nestlé. They utilized the legal discovery process to force corporate executives onto the witness stand under oath. They flew in prominent pediatricians and medical experts from across Africa and South America. One after another, international doctors stood in the Swiss courtroom and testified about the grim reality they witnessed every day. They presented photographic evidence of severely emaciated infants. They brought in data showing that a child raised on formula in a poor village was up to 15 times more likely to die of diarrheal dehydration than a breastfed child. They proved that Nestlé knew their product was being used with contaminated water, and that their nurse marketing was an intentional, deceptive masquerade. The trial dragged on for over a year, becoming a global media circus. Every day that Nestlé's lawyers spent trying to argue technicalities, the front pages of newspapers around the world were filled with graphic descriptions of infant deaths and corporate negligence. The public relations disaster was total. Nestlé had walked directly into a trap of its own making. By suing for defamation, they had forced the global press to examine the exact evidence they wanted to keep hidden. In June of 1976, the judge finally handed down his verdict. On a strict, narrow interpretation of Swiss statutory law, the activists were found technically guilty of defamation because the phrase, Nestlé Kills Babies, was a simplified, provocative slogan rather than a nuanced legal statement. The activists were ordered to pay a symbolic, minimal fine of 300 Swiss francs each. But the verdict was a devastating, historic defeat for the corporation. The judge did something completely unprecedented in Swiss corporate history. In his official written opinion, he delivered a scathing public condemnation of Nestlé. He stated plainly that the evidence presented in court proved that the company's marketing methods in the developing world were unethical and deeply dangerous. He concluded with a chilling warning to the board of directors. Nestlé must fundamentally alter its business model because their current practices were actively endangering human lives. The corporate victory was entirely hollow. The highest legal authority in Bern had just confirmed the core of the activists' warning. The verdict in Bern did not end the war. It served as the catalyst for a global rebellion. In 1977, the details of the Swiss trial crossed the Atlantic and reached the United States. A group of American grassroots activists realized that while Nestlé was a Swiss entity, its profits came heavily from the American consumer market. They formed the Infant Formula Action Coalition, known simply as InFact, and launched the most ambitious, well-organized consumer boycott in American history. The movement targeted Nestlé's entire corporate portfolio. Activists distributed lists of Nestlé-owned brands to millions of households across the United States. American mothers began actively boycotting Stauffer's frozen foods, Libby's canned goods, Taster's Choice coffee, and Nesquik chocolate milk. College students marched across campuses, forcing university cafeterias to ban all Nestlé products. Activists stood outside suburban supermarkets, holding up large chimes and banners, demonstrating to shoppers exactly what happened to infants when they used the company's formula. The economic and reputational damage to the corporation inside the United States became severe. The boycott grew so powerful that it caught the attention of the United States Senate. In May of 1978, Senator Edward Kennedy convened a series of intense congressional hearings into the marketing practices of the infant formula industry in the Third World. The hearings were a public disaster for Nestlé's senior management. Senator Kennedy and other lawmakers subjected the company's executives to a brutal, public cross-examination broadcast across national television. When the executives tried to claim that their marketing was benign, Kennedy produced the company's own internal advertising materials, which showed images of healthy babies and explicit text suggesting that formula was superior to a mother's care. The moral defense of the corporation crumbled completely on the Senate floor. The relentless pressure from the American public and the United States government forced the international community to act. In 1981, the World Health Assembly met in Geneva and adopted the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. It was a historic, sweeping document that explicitly banned all public advertising of infant formula, prohibited the distribution of free samples to pregnant women, and outlawed the use of corporate sales reps disguised as medical staff. Every nation voted to approve the code, except for one. The United States administration, under heavy pressure from domestic corporate lobbyists, cast the sole negative vote. But the global tide had turned. Nestlé realized that their brand could not survive another decade of absolute public warfare. In 1984, after 7 long years of economic boycotts and public shaming, the corporation finally capitulated, signing an official agreement to implement the international code across all its global operations. The corporate capitulation of 1984 was celebrated as a historic victory for public health and grassroots activism. It proved that a dedicated network of journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens could successfully force a multi-billion-dollar empire to change its behavior. The aggressive, deceptive campaign of the fake nurses was dismantled, and the distribution of free, predatory samples in hospitals was legally restricted. But inside the corporate world, the fundamental lesson learned was entirely different from the one celebrated by the public. For the executives and shareholders, the scandal was not viewed as a moral tragedy. It was managed as a complex, decade-long public relations crisis that had to be stabilized to protect the bottom line. The marketing strategy was altered only because the reputational cost had finally exceeded the profit margin generated by the deception. Decades after the official boycott ended, the true human cost of the strategy remains nearly impossible to calculate. A comprehensive retrospective study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research utilized large-scale demographic data to analyze the peak years of the formula campaign. The economists reached a staggering, horrific conclusion. At the height of Nestlé's marketing push in the 1970s and 1980s, the introduction of infant formula into environment-stressed households was linked to an estimated 200,000 excess infant deaths every single year. 200,000 children died annually, not because of a failure of science, but because a corporate boardroom decided that an artificial market expansion was worth the biological risk. Today, Nestlé remains one of the largest food conglomerates on Earth, its bird's nest logo still conveying an image of warmth, nutrition, and safety to billions of shoppers in everyday supermarkets. The memory of the trial in Bern, the investigative report by Mike Müller, and the rows of empty metal cribs in overcrowded tropical hospitals have been systematically scrubbed from the corporate biography, buried under billions of dollars of modern advertising. But the history stands as an absolute, uncompromising warning. It is a reminder that when an institution is built on the singular metric of infinite financial growth, human life becomes nothing more than a variable in an equation, and a corporate logo can easily become the most deceptive mask a monster will ever wear.